The Chosen Season 5, Episode 2 is really interesting, and I think it houses my favorite scene from The Chosen ever, which is really hard to say because I love all of The Chosen and I've seen all the episodes so many times. Man, is it hard to beat some of my favorite scenes, and I think this episode did it, but there are also some scenes that kind of let me down a little bit. So we're going to talk about this episode overall, talk about everything that's kind of hidden within here, and we're definitely going to jump into it. So let's just go straight in. First off, again, at the beginning of this episode, we have an opening scene from the Last Supper. This, of course, is going to continue on throughout the rest of the series, or throughout the rest of the season here, as we focus on the Last Supper. And I wonder what they're going to do with it as we get into part 2 and 3, if that's going to change things at all, or if we're just going to keep on getting Last Supper kind of clips at the beginning here. Now, we are going, as I mentioned in my part 1 video, if you haven't seen episode 1, my overview of that, go watch that first, because there's going to be a lot of stuff we're going to build on from that. But we actually start at the end of the Last Supper, as I talked about there. So now we're going from John chapter 17 to John chapter 16 to John chapter 13 and 15, and now we're kind of going backwards in time. This one starts off with this section right here. Now, Jesus doesn't say this, but he actually starts with this line right here. Will you lay down your life for me? But before that, we see, where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow me afterward. Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. I think we'll get this probably in episode 3 or something similar, but we get this portion here. Will you lay down your life for me? Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Now they move this section to another section, which we're going to read in a bit, but it starts off with this. Will you lay down your life with me? Life for me? And then we kind of skip to some other sections here as well. We go to Luke chapter 22, and this is where we get the majority of kind of what's going on here. We see as Jesus begins, he says, Simon, Simon. This is a really interesting beginning to what we're seeing here. You can actually see as Peter is visibly confused because his name is not Simon anymore, right? He hasn't been called Simon for a long time. But Jesus here is using his name Simon very specifically. What he's saying is, like, you're going to mess up, dude. Like, you're not going to be perfect here. You're not going to be the leader that I want you to be. You're going to be the one that falls into sin. It's going to be hard, you know? So he says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And again, Jesus in The Chosen, he says, I have prayed for you specifically, right? He's prayed for Peter specifically, for Simon specifically. That his faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. But Peter said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you, both to prison and to death. And we see that in The Chosen as well. Then Jesus continues, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you have denied me, denied 3 times that you even know me. Now, he said this to them, when I sent you out with no money bag or knapsack or sandals, did you lack anything? Now he's talking about the 2x2 mission here, which he talks about in The Chosen. He says, when I sent you out in the 2x2. And so they all say kind of like nothing. No, we're not missing anything. Nothing. And then Jesus says nothing. But now let the one who has a money bag take it, and likewise a knapsack. And let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. And so he tells that in The Chosen, it's more specific towards them. In episode 2, the scripture that we're seeing here is a little bit less one for one, like word for word, than we saw in episode 1. There's kind of a little bit more of moving around to make it feel a little bit more natural, which we see in The Chosen all the time, right? And so then immediately after he says this portion, Simon gets up and we see this portion right here. And they said, look, Lord, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough. And so we see Simon the Zealot get up and he grabs the 2 swords and he's like, look, we have 2 swords. And he's like, I don't know if that's going to be enough for us to defend all 12 of us. And then John actually corrects him and he says, no, 11. Because Judas has already gone from the table. And John, I think, is one of the only ones that's picking up on who is going to betray Jesus. The rest of them are not quite sure at this moment. And so we see that kind of play out there as we see that. Then we see Luke 22:31. Am I missing something here? I think I am. Yeah. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away because of me this night." And they're all like, "What? What are you talking about? We're not going to fall away. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee," which of course we know happens after Jesus is raised and after he's resurrected. He sees them in Galilee. He sees them in a couple different places. But Peter answered him, "Though all may fall away, because of you, I will never fall away." And so Peter's like, "Okay, I don't care about all these other guys. Like, they may fall away, but I am definitely not going to," right? And Jesus said to him, "Truly, I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And that's where we kind of see this laid out in the Chosen here. And Peter said, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples kind of said the same. And that's kind of where the scene ends. All of them are kind of talking over Jesus and kind of chatting here as they go through. And so that's where we see that. He actually ends the scene by saying this right here in John chapter 15, "Greater love has no one than this, that someone laid down his life for his friends." And then Peter kind of speaks up and he's like, "Then that's what I'll do. I'll lay down my life," right? He's kind of very boisterous and confident about this. And then Jesus says, "No, that's what I will do." And that's how the scene ends there, which is really beautiful. Then we get the intro. And then as we come into the episode, we actually don't go to present time. We come back from this flash forward and we go into a flashback. And this is something that I called months ago. And this is a flashback to, spoiler alert, Rama. Rama is with her mother as her mother is gifting her a necklace. And so she's giving her this necklace because it is the first... it's the first time that Rama has ever gone out on her own to do catering for a wedding. Okay. And of course we know what wedding that is, right? It's the first time that she's with Thomas and they go on this trip by themselves, basically. Now we see Rama's mother, whose name is Naomi. We hear that later in the episode, but I'll tell you here. Naomi, and she gives her this necklace, and they talk about her going out on her first solo job and how excited they are and how her mother is so proud of her and how amazing she is and all that kind of stuff. And so obviously we see Yasmin kind of coming back into the fold and she's obviously, I'm sure she had a lot of fun being able to film with the group again. Now, I was surprised before we saw some of the leaks and the behind the scenes and stuff of seeing Yasmin coming back. I was surprised that they would bring her back so quickly, at least for just a flashback scene, clearly. It's not like she's resurrected or anything like that yet. but we see her there as she's kind of talking through. And it's a nice kind of family moment, right? Then after this, we kind of go outside and they're getting the cart ready, and it's Thomas without his beard. He looks really young again. It looks like back in season 1, right? He's wearing his old colorful outer layer, his outer tunic. And then Rama and her mother Naomi come outside and they meet with Kaphne and Thomas as they're kind of getting everything ready. Kaphne is actually talking with Thomas about the wedding in Cana and how all that's going to work. And he is actually apparently old friends with Rafi. They had a relationship at some point a long time ago. And so he hasn't seen Rafi for a long time, but because they were friends before and he was a good man when they were friends, he's actually going to bring better wine than Rafi ordered. So he's going to give him the 15-year vintage wine, which is what Rama hands to them when she goes to the wedding back in season 1, episode 5. And so it's a beautiful kind of moment there with Kaphne and Thomas as they're really getting along. Kaphne seems to really like Thomas. And while he may be giving him a hard time here and there, like he's definitely like a father figure to him. We get some insight here as Kaphne and Naomi kind of send them off on their way. This is essentially right where we pick up on season 1, episode 5. So right where Rama and Thomas are kind of loading up the cart and getting ready to leave. That's essentially like right where we pick up as Kaphne and Naomi are leaving them and kind of sending them off. And so it's a beautiful kind of moment there. It's a cool cinematic moment as well as they're kind of all coming in. But we see as Kaphne and Naomi have a really cute kind of family moment as they're walking away. And we've never really seen Kaphne like this, right? The moment that we saw Kaphne for the first time, he was already heartbroken. And we kind of figure out a little bit more why. And he talks about how he remembers when Thomas came to them as an orphan, as he was a young kid, and just wanted to work on their vineyard because he needed money, right? And so he actually has been working with Cophny for a long time, and it's almost like he's a son to them in a way, a son that they kind of want to marry their daughter, right? And so Naomi is talking with him back and forth and saying like, you can take credit for Thomas, I'll take credit for Rama and all the good things about her. And it's a really cute family moment that we haven't really ever gotten with Cophny or that family, right? We've always seen that Cophny is upset and he's mad and he's not a very nice guy, right? And so we're seeing that nicer side of him. And it made me think of like, not only did Cophny lose Rama, but he also lost Thomas, who was basically like a son to him, you know? We know that he has at least one other son because Rama talks about her brother, who I think we've seen in the first episode, but it's not clearly denoted that that's his son. So can't say for sure. But we do get this really cute moment, which I loved at the beginning. I thought it was really great. But they all get along well. They go off on their own. Then we finally skip to present day, where we get Simon preaching for the first time. Now, this is a scene that we got some insight in early on, whenever they were doing some behind the scenes video on the Chosen app. They talked about this scene in particular with Simon kind of bumbling through his first time preaching. He keeps on messing up or mixing up the different words, mixing up the different things that he's talking about. And he's having some issues with it where Andrew has to kind of like remind him like, hey, like it's 1 denarii or half a denarii. Like, he's kind of helping him through. The parable that he's trying to preach here comes from Matthew chapter 18. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying this video and you want to see more stuff from The Chosen or behind the scenes things, I just had a long conversation with Dallas Jenkins over in Texas, and I just released it on my Patreon. If you're interested in seeing this, here's a little bit of a sneak peek, and I'd love to see you over there.
Thank you so much for doing this, by the way.
Yeah, man.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's fun.
So, you're Mormon, right?
Oh, jeez. I should have been prepared for that. Yes, I'm Mormon, and under this is a pride flag that I will be revealing in just a couple moments.
Yeah, no, obviously I'm kidding. Yeah. But I wanted to start out with the criticisms because I know every single video that I do about you or with you or whatever, there's always so many criticisms that are just easily kind of like, okay, let's get those out of the way, and then we can talk about the real stuff.
Well, and there's some that still come up still.
Right.
All
right, I hope you like that. Let's get back to the video, which is the parable of the unforgiving servant. And so we see him preach through some of this section that's highlighted here. He says, and since he could not pay his master, ordered him to be sold with his wife and his children. But he's kind of messing up all this section here. He's like, he ordered him to be sold, and his wife and all that he had. And his children and all that he had. And then the rest of this, he actually gets pretty well. So he did a pretty good job. And payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, have patience with me and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of the servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when the same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii and seized him. He began to choke him, saying, pay what you owe. So he gets some of this wrong too as well, unless it's different in a different version of in a different gospel. In this one, he says half a denarii. But here it's 100 denarii. So I think he either just got that wrong to put a bigger point to that, or it's different in another gospel. I wouldn't imagine so. I'd imagine it's the same. But anyway, it was really interesting. During this time, we're kind of showing the crowd. There's a pretty large crowd that's kind of gathering to hear Peter preach. And then also we see the watcher on the stairs. Now, this is the second time that we have seen the bottom of the watcher's robes. Now, I think, like I said earlier in episode 1, that the watcher is probably Luke, most likely Luke at this point. Now that we have some more information from episode 1 and some different things kind of going on, there's a couple of different things that point me in that direction, and episode 2 gives us some pretty good clues. Number 1, we see that he doesn't have any seat. As far as I can tell, in every shot that I've seen of the bottom of the watcher's robe, he does not wear seat. So what does that tell us? He's either 1, not Jewish at all, or he is a Jew, but he doesn't practice wearing that type of stuff. For example, like the Hellenized Jew that we met, what is his name? The healer from season 3, from the season 3 finale, 7 and 8. What is his name? I can't remember off the top of my head, but the healer, Nadab, it just came to me. There you go. Nadab from season 3, episodes 7 and 8. He is a Jew, but he's a Hellenized Jew. Right? So he goes to Shmuel, and Shmuel's like, where are your seat? Why are you wearing blended cloth, right? These are all things against the law, okay? I think that this guy is similar to that, which is what we believe that Luke was. Similarly to Timothy, we believe he's Jewish adjacent. Like, he's connected to the Jews, but he's either a Hellenized Jew or something else along those lines. But his name, for example, Luke, is definitely not a Jewish name. It's more of a Roman name, so it makes sense that he would be some sort of Hellenized Jew in some sort of way, right? So that points us to it being maybe Luke, but at the very least, it points us to that he's not a dedicated Jew. Okay, so that gives us a big hint there. We see kind of the bottom of his clothing as he's standing on the stairs. Now, Simon the Zealot notices the Watcher standing over there for the first time, and then we get through the rest of Peter's preaching as we go. And so we see this funny moment with Peter preaching. He kind of messes up. Andrew helps him through it. Then afterwards, they see as they're kind of debriefing what happened here. Peter is freaking out. He's like, man, I messed it up so bad. I did horrible. This is so horrible. And then Andrew's like, nah, dude, you did great. You're so awesome. Like, that was so epic. Like, I'm so proud of you, you know? And then Peter was like, yeah, you did a good, or Philip was like, yeah, you did a good job. And then we see Simon the Zealot bring up the Watcher, and he's like, hey, some guy was watching you. He's writing down all this stuff. And he's like, was he a Pharisee? And then he's like, no, I don't think so. So they don't know who he is, but they wanted to pay attention to it, right? There's some guy that was watching them that was writing stuff down, essentially. So that's really all that they talk about there overall. But Peter thinks he was horrible. Andrew is proud of him. And that's pretty much what happens during that debrief section there. Now, this next little tiny bit here is quite interesting. And some people in the chat are talking about how it could be Mark. It is not Mark, and we'll talk about why in a second here. Let me get through this section. So the Watcher is then seen in a kind of a transition scene as he walks through a crowd of people. The camera is very intent on showing us how he's walking through that crowd. In particular, there's one specific movement that he makes that made me go, huh, that's weird. And it's when he grabs kind of the shoulder of a woman and kind of like moves past her. If he was Jewish, he would not do this, okay? And we see this evidenced within the Chosen overall quite a lot of times, okay? Unless someone's life is in danger or like something crazy is happening, you are not going to see a random male touch a random female. It's just not going to happen. But the Chosen makes it a point to show us that that's the case. This, again, is another kind of evidence that he's some sort of Hellenistic Jew at the very least. It seems like he's Jewish because in an earlier scene, we saw him say shalom, shalom, but he doesn't do a lot of the things that Jewish people do. So yeah, it's hard to say, right? It's hard to say who he is. But keep that in mind because we're going to get to this next scene and it kind of clarifies some of the things that we're seeing here. Now, within that crowd, there was a woman who was actually a spy for Caiaphas. And so she goes back to Caiaphas's palace and reports to Malchus. Malchus is a new character that we're meeting in this season, but he is a very important scriptural character. Not only is he kind of the main head servant of Caiaphas, who kind of deals with all the stuff that Caiaphas needs done, but he is also the one in the Garden of Gethsemane later on, probably in the beginning of season 6 or the end of season 5, that is going to get his ear cut off in the garden when Jesus is being arrested. So he gets his ear cut off by Peter. But it's interesting because he actually starts to form a relationship with John in this episode. And so we're going to see more of that as well. But she reports to Malchus, like what has been happening, that Peter was just preaching, nothing crazy going on. He was just preaching about forgiveness. And so she talks about that there. And so we get a little bit of a moment there. We also get a little bit of a section where Malchus says, okay, he has to go meet the new olive oil vendor later on, which if you've been watching my videos at all, you know is going to be Zebedee. So we'll talk about that later. Then we cut to another scene with Tamar and Philip and Andrew. Yeah, Tamar, Philip, and Andrew, where they run into the Greeks. So earlier on during Peter's preaching, we see that Leander and Dion and Fatia, who are from season 3, the finale there, they're the kind of the leaders of these different groups. Well, Leander's not really, but Fatia and Dion are kind of leaders of these Grecian sort of, like I say Grecian in quotes, like it's not really Grecian, like Nabatean and different things like that, groups that were obviously part of the feeding the 5,000. And so we see them come back and they actually want to celebrate Passover. Now, this scene in particular is this scene is probably the one scene where I was kind of like, like it just feels weird. Like this is, I don't, honestly, if I could take this episode and edit it, I think I would just chop out a big portion of this scene. And I don't mean that to be like rude or to like, you know, to like knock on the writing. I think obviously the writing is 10 out of 10 always in The Chosen. But this section of exposition here is probably the one spot where I was like, man, this is dragging. It feels weird. And then on top of that, I just think it's not necessary. The exposition kind of starts here when they talk about Passover and what Passover is. So they begin talking about kind of what is going on in Passover. How do they celebrate Passover? What do they need to do? Because these Greeks, the Leander and Fatia and Dion, they don't really know what to do. They've never celebrated Passover. They're just kind of like new converts, right? That are coming to Judaism. They're trying to understand like what is going on here, right? Christianity within itself is not a thing yet, right? There just are Jewish people who are followers of Jesus. And now there are Gentiles that are followers of Jesus. And so we're seeing that kind of play out. Now, throughout this section, they talk about how they're going to need a sacrifice. They're talking about what coinage they have. And he talks about how they have Greek drachma. And then he says, Philip takes one of the coins and he says, like whose face is on this? And it's the goddess of the hunt. And so they talk about that there. And so they talk about, since they have the Greek drachma, they actually can't use that within the temple to buy a sacrifice. They're going to need the temple coins. And so those are silver coins. And so they need to exchange those in order to get the right currency in order to buy the sacrifice. Because you can't buy the sacrifice for God with the face of some other, deity on it, right? You don't want to do that. So they continue on. They said that you're going to need to exchange it, but you got to be careful because there's a lot of predatory practices when the exchanging of the money, as well as if you're going to try to use credit. Fatia goes, oh, do they accept credit, right? And she's not talking about like a credit card, but literally like a loan, right, from somebody. And he says, yes, you can do a loan. This is Philip talking. He says, yeah, you can do a loan, but it's very predatory. There's really high interest. I would really suggest you not do that. And so they continue on. They talk about Jesus and his thoughts about this. Fatia actually asks, does Jesus approve of all of this? And then Andrew says he did say that he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it and interpret it correctly. And then Fatia kind of says, well, you didn't really answer my question, right? So they left it kind of up into the air because clearly we don't sacrifice today. So there are some things which are not used anymore, right? That's kind of what I think that's kind of what they're getting at there. Now, this was a pretty long section of exposition where they're talking about all these different things. The reason why I think it's not necessary is because then the next scene, they talk about all of it again. So to me, it was just like, wait, didn't we just go through all of this? Like what? Like one of the things that I love about The Chosen, let me start here. One of the things that I love most about The Chosen, most about Ryan and Tyler and Dallas's writing, is that they don't think that I'm stupid, right? They don't explain things multiple times. They don't show things like you're a baby and you need to see it, right? They let the cultural things and the historical things kind of lie where they are, and they tell the story how it is, right? Now, there are some expositional moments, but normally they're done like really, really, really well. For example, there's another scene later in this episode that we're going to talk about that is my favorite scene of all of The Chosen, which I think is a great scene that is entirely exposition. Okay. And I love it. It's an amazing scene. But here, there is just some things like in the writing, sure, where they're kind of like duplicating things and doing extra. But I think also in some of the acting just felt a little bit slow, a little bit weird. There were even points where some of the actors felt like they were forgetting their lines mid-line, and then they were kind of like catching up to it. So it feels a little bit weird there. And I was kind of disappointed in some of the acting in this scene, to be honest. But we get to the next scene and they're talking to the money changer. And what do they talk about? They talk about Leander and how he has Greek drachma. They talk about how he has to exchange it. They talk about the exchange rate. They talk about how the temple takes a tax. They talk about what sort of animal that they need, right? So these are all things that they've just spoken about 5 seconds ago. So why are we getting this twice? I guess is my question there. It just felt a little bit weird, and it made this whole section feel like strange overall. Just it made it feel strange overall. So I would probably just edit out that other section, just like cut it out of the episode and just leave it to where they go straight to the money changer to talk about it there, because that makes way more sense to me in order to do it there. That's how I do it. But we continue on. There's some tension between the money changer and them as Leander hands over 10 drachma, and then the money changer is like, okay, now you're going to need to add 4.5 drachma on top of that. So let's call it 14 drachma. You know, he's adding like a 40% tax basically on top of that in order to pay the temple tax, in order to pay himself, in order to, you know, do all the things that Rome has asked them to do, all that kind of stuff. So he talks about that, and they're kind of like, I really don't like this. You know, it's annoying to have to pay all that and all that different things. But they do eventually pay it. And they kind of get through this section, and he goes through the whole thing here. Now the women try to pay as well, and Fatia figures out that they don't actually have to do this portion. They don't have to do what the men are doing here because it's not for the women, it's only for the men. So they go off and they're going to actually buy birds instead. They decide to go and buy pigeons. And so we're going to deep dive into all that stuff later, what it means to dive into like what type of sacrifice for what type of thing. Essentially, it's like the smaller the sin, the less sin that you have, the smaller the animal. Then you go all the way up to like a big bull, and that's like you've sinned a lot. Like this guy's messed up, you know? So they talk a little bit here. They walk around the temple area. They talk about how there's a sign in the temple area, which we've talked about many times actually on the channel. There's a sign in the temple area before you get to the court of women that basically says any Gentiles that pass here, you're going to die. Like, don't do it. Don't pass this section. You're passing this, under threat of death, essentially. And either God will kill you or maybe the temple guard, like, who knows? There's like, you're taking your life into your own hands if you walk past this sign, essentially. And so all the Gentiles that are with the group, clearly they don't go past that sign, but they read about it in order to give us some context as to what's happening there. Then the women say they're going to go to the bird vendor in order to get birds, to get pigeons. Now, this is a really interesting section. I know a lot of people in the chat were saying like this scene didn't really make sense, and I agree. There are parts of it that feel quite awkward. So let's talk about it here. So Tamar and Fatia, they go towards the bird vendor in order to get some pigeons to sacrifice. Tamar goes up and she says, okay, these look good. Can I have 2 pigeons, basically, or 2 sets of pigeons? And then the guy that is at the booth immediately does not speak common language to her, which at the time would be either Hebrew or Greek or something, but he speaks not in English to us, but actually in another language, which I think is Egyptian. I don't know 100% because I don't speak Egyptian, but I tried to look up some comparisons of what ancient Egyptian would sound like there, and it sounds sort of similar, and that's what Tamar spoke back in season 1, episode 6. So it makes sense to me that they would be speaking Egyptian there, although I don't know. So we get talking with this guy. He immediately speaks in another language. Tamar also is speaking back to him in that same language, and they're talking about some different things. He says that she reminds him of his sister, who has passed away at this point. And they begin kind of talking about some different things, where they're from and different things like that. She says that she's from Ethiopia, which we've talked about since season 1. And then he says that he's not from Ethiopia, but basically that he knows some of the same things that she knows from her area. So they're both from Africa. Okay. He says specifically that he's not from Ethiopia, but he's from Libya. We'll get back to this. Listen, keep that in your bookmarks. Okay. He's from Libya. So he offers these doves instead of pigeons. He offers 2 doves each for Tamar and for Fatia, completely for free. Now, this whole time, it's kind of like a flirty feeling moment where Tamar and this guy are like, You know, they're flirting. He's not saying his name, by the way, which I think is a huge hint. Normally when we meet someone, maybe not all the time, but generally we'll get some sort of name or something, especially if they're a character we're going to see later on. But they really made this guy seem like he's an important character, but they didn't give us a name or anything. And so they begin to kind of like talk through and have this flirty moment, and then they take the doves. She tries to pay for at least the price of the pigeons, and he denies it, and he just says, you know, because you remind me of my estranged sister, essentially, you know, I'll give you these for free. Also during this conversation, she asks why he's doing this, if he's from Libya, and he says that he's just making money for his sons, essentially. So I don't know if he's married and he's looking for another wife, or or if his wife has died and he has other sons, or what is happening there. It doesn't really give us a lot of explanation. Now, Libya. Why would he say Libya? Why would this be important? Well, there's a character in the Bible from that area. We know him as Simon of Cyrene. Really quick aside here, because I didn't explain this super well in the stream, so let me explain it here. So you have Cyrene, which of course we know is a location in the scriptures, but during the time of Jesus, Libya was not actually really a place during that time. It's actually called by some other names. So whenever the vendor here says he's from Libya, I think that's for modern audiences to understand that he's from the area of Cyrene. And of course, that's connected to Cyrene. They're not going to just tell us, hey, he's from Cyrene. They want to keep that as a secret for season 6. So, but obviously this is connected for sure. He wouldn't be talking to Tamar in this way, kind of associating that they're both African, as well as telling us the exact location where he's from without this being someone special. So obviously this is Simon of Cyrene, which is a really, really cool thing. Now, of course, we're going to see Simon of Cyrene later on in season 6 as he helps Jesus carry the cross. Here is that verse here, so you can read it and check it out for yourselves. Of course, we'll deep dive it next year whenever we get into season 6 of The Chosen. All right, let's get back to the video. I believe, at least, that this is Simon of Cyrene. And so he, of course, is going to be an important character. One of the things that led me to him being an important character early on was that he took a photo with like all of the main cast during the behind the scenes photos. And it's like, when that happens, like that's generally how we figured out that Luke was Judas in season 2. And then a bunch of other stuff around that, clearly. But yeah, so I think he's going to be an important character in season 6. I don't know if we'll see him much more in season 5. It seems like they're kind of like sparking up a romance with him and Tamar. So who knows? But I believe Simon of Cyrene has 2 sons. I believe that everything kind of lines up for him to be that guy. Yeah, but obviously if they said, yeah, my name is Simon and I'm from Cyrene, like that would be too obvious, clearly. But I definitely think they gave us enough clues to lock down who that guy is for sure. As we continue on. All right, next up, we see the new oil vendor. So after Simon of Cyrene and the whole Tamar scene, we see the new oil vendor with Malchus. Malchus is walking with John and Zebedee. Zebedee, of course, has been kind of building his empire of being an oil vendor, and now somehow he has gotten into Jerusalem itself. So now he is the oil vendor for all of the Holy Week, basically the whole entire temple of Jerusalem, which is crazy, right? Now this is probably not a biblical thing. This is probably not a scriptural thing. Of course, we don't know that Zebedee or anybody associated with Jesus was like an oil vendor, for example. We don't know that that Zebedee quit his job and became an oil vendor, all that kind of stuff. And especially, this would be very strange if he was the oil vendor for Jerusalem during the week that Jesus was crucified, and it's not mentioned anywhere in scripture. So obviously, this is an extracurricular sort of addition, right? But it is pretty cool. This is an interesting section here, and we'll talk about some things that people got upset about in this section as well. Malchus, who again is the servant of Caiaphas, he's the kind of the head servant, is leading John and Zebedee as they are kind of wheeling in a giant cart of oil into the court of women. This is the section where the housing of the oil would take place. Okay. And so we see that there. We see that Malchus talks a little bit about how they need to be ritually pure. They need to have bathed in a mikveh, and obviously they came in through the beautiful gate, which means that they've probably already done that before they came into the temple. And so he says, yes, we've done that. We're clean, blah, blah, blah. Then he talks about how the master of the oils is going to need to have an extra sort of like criteria for them to be even more clean than just ritually pure. So he's going to read out a list to them of special things that they need to have done or not done in order to come into the room where all the oil is stored. Okay. Then Malchus, as they get closer to the door, he says, oh, hi, there's Rabbi Zebediah. Rabbi Zebediah, of course, is the one that has been yelling at them and threatened to stone them, and did try to stone them just, a few days earlier. And so he opens the door and he goes, yes, I know these ones. But luckily he's not hostile. He's being pretty nice as he's looking towards John and Zebedee. And they begin talking, and then Malchus says, hey, I'm going to go and watch the cart as you guys go in. You know how dangerous the temple is. Got to go watch that cart. You wouldn't even believe the type of people who would try to steal that cart. And clearly it's not the actual reason why he's going, but he says that there. Then Rabbi Zebediah begins to read out this criteria that you have to be pure of before you can come in. He says these things. He says, the past 7 days you have not touched a corpse, touched a mole or a mouse or a lizard, come into contact with a menstruating woman, or a chair which she sat on, or a vessel that she's used. And then he says, or had a seminal discharge in your sleep, been diagnosed with leprosy, or eaten unclean foods. Okay. So we'll break this down in a second, but he basically asked them, like, Zebedee, are you good with all that? And Zebedee's like, yeah, I'm good. I haven't done any of that stuff. And then he looks at John, and John's like, and then Malchus grabs him and says, okay, maybe you should come in and sit with me. We'll watch the cart together, and they go off on their own, and Zebedee goes into the oil chamber with Rabbi Zebediah. Now here, Malchus and him have a conversation, and I think a lot of people misconstrued this conversation because I got a lot of comments that were like weird, right? That were weird about this. So first off, Malchus says, you know what? You should wait outside with me. And then they talk about why they're disqualified. And clearly Malchus is kind of joking with him and talking with him, but John says leprosy. Now we know the one that stands out in this one as a whole, right? And that is clearly the seminal discharge in their sleep. What does this mean? Well, it means that they've had a wet dream. Okay. And everybody should know what a wet dream is, right? I shouldn't have to explain that. But essentially, that's what they're saying. They're saying this is an added thing on top of the law that the Rabbi Zebediah, wanted to make sure that people were even more clean past what the law says. Now they begin talking about the law, and they talk about how old men are punishing us for having bodies, is what Malchus says here. Obviously, a wet dream is a normal thing that happens, especially to young men, but even any men, right? As that's kind of a normal thing that a body will do. And they talk about a lot of different things here. So I saw some people misconstruing this and thinking that they were talking about like masturbation, which is just, it's not the case. Here they're talking about a wet dream, right? So this is an awkward thing, but that's why they couldn't enter. And then Malchus and John go into this conversation about how Rabbi Zebediah and the other leaders of the law, they make up these rules on top of the law in order to feel more holy themselves, okay? And so the whole idea here is that Zebediah is basically like relishing the fact that he gets to turn away people because he is holier than them. He can go in, but because they've done this thing, they can't, okay? And so that's kind of what they're talking about there. Now this goes on to the normal nature of these religious leaders, which Malchus, he's the closest to Caiaphas. So he begins talking about Caiaphas and how Caiaphas is even obsessed with a new rabbi in town. And he doesn't necessarily name Jesus by name, but John knows who he's talking about immediately and begins to kind of pry and ask some questions here. And Malchus kind of gets to the point where he's like, this is dangerous for Caiaphas because Caiaphas has to do something. And if he doesn't do something, he's going to get fired. If he does something, he could get fired anyway. So like he could lose his job, he could lose his position, he could lose his status. And that would not be a good thing for Caiaphas overall. And so he wants to avoid that essentially. Then they begin talking specifically about Passover. Passover is in 3 days from now, from this point in the story. And so they say Passover is in 3 days. So he has to do something before then because you cannot have a trial during Passover. Okay. And so John is like, oh yeah, true. I forgot about that sort of thing. And then they kind of end the conversation there as they're interrupted by Zebedee and Zebediah as they come out of the oil room, and then they begin to leave. As they leave, Zebedee kind of looks at John like with this like judgmental sort of like, like kind of look, the joke there. Now in my theater, I don't think the joke landed super well. There were some people that laughed, but not a ton. In the premiere theater, I think a lot more people got it. So I think it'll just depend on what kind of theater you're in, but know that it's not like John sinned or something like that. Like it's just he was unclean because Zebediah said that he was unclean because of the seminal discharge. So that's enough talking about that. All right, now for the grand event. Let me take a sip of water. For the grand event here, we have my favorite scene of the episode, and I think my favorite scene of all time in The Chosen. This was so well done, and in contrast to the expositional scene that we saw earlier in the episode, this one I think ticks all the boxes for being a 10 out of 10 amazingly written scene. So let's go through this. This is Caiaphas and Herod Antipas as they are talking, sitting across the table from each other. Okay. This whole entire scene is exposition, talking about the week of Jesus's, Holy Week and what's going on here and who they should kill and what they should do. Right. There's this battle that's happening kind of in this scene, a rivalry of authorities that is, it's really powerful. And not only that, but the acting in this scene, I think is the best acting that we've seen in any scene in The Chosen so far. I was really, really impressed, particularly with Paul Ben-Victor, who plays Herod Antipas. I think his rendition of Herod is by far the best that I've seen, but also in this scene in particular was, man, it was so good. It was just so good. Just the little tiny nuances that he added in, the little tiny things that he's adding in here. I just thought it was amazing. So let's go through it. First thing, they start eating. Of course, they're at a table. They have a lot of extravagant kind of meal, like food in front of them, a meal together they have. And Caiaphas is feeling the pressure, okay? He knows, just like we talked about in the previous scene with Malchus and John, that if he makes a mistake, he's going to lose his status, he's going to lose his position, or worse, right? There could be a lot of different punishments for him if he does not handle this correctly. And it's a very nerve-wracking thing for him to do, and he has people pulling him on every single side. And so he's really worried about that. You see that anxiety kind of building up in him. While Herod seems like he doesn't care. Like he's just kind of like leaned back. He's eating food. He's chilling out. He's totally nonchalant, at least on the surface, right? There's a part of him that definitely does care and is worried about what's going to go on, but a lot of the weight is on Caiaphas at the moment, okay? So Herod relays a message from Pilate back from season 4. Pilate says in season 4 that maybe they should kill Lazarus in order to quell all the theories of Jesus being the Messiah. Because the reason why people are believing in Jesus and wanting to follow him is because Lazarus is back from the dead. However, if they kill Lazarus, then he won't be back from the dead, right? And so that is kind of the theory that Pilate wants to go on. He's telling Herod to kind of relay that to Caiaphas so that Caiaphas can kill Lazarus. That's what his plan is. Then they kind of go on this conversation. They're like, you can't just like kill somebody, right? The only time when we can execute capital punishment is on temple grounds. That's the only place that this can happen. And we can't just, randomly kill this guy, either Jesus or Lazarus, right? And so Herod says, this is a really interesting moment here. He says, haven't your people already tried stoning Jesus? Like your people have already tried stoning him. And then Caiaphas really perks up. He's like, your people, because Herod is supposed to be Jewish, right? So Caiaphas is like, your people, our people, Antipas. And so he kind of like really chews him out there. I thought that was amazing. You act like you're not one of us, is what he says. Then they continue on. They have this conversation. And then Caiaphas goes into how he has had a prophecy from the Lord. Now, we've heard this again in season 4, but we're going to hear a lot more about it in season 5. Caiaphas has had a prophecy from the Lord, which we see in scripture, that one man will die in order to save the rest of them, right? And in Caiaphas's mind, he thinks, okay, one man will die in order to save the rest of the Jewish people. But in actuality, God is clearly talking about Jesus, who will die on a cross to save all of humanity, right? So it's a much bigger thing than what Caiaphas thinks about when he is going into this in general. And so we're seeing that there. He talks about that prophecy. And he goes, Herod Antipas goes, oh, I had forgotten that the two of you speak, talking about Caiaphas and God, right? He says, I had forgotten the two of you speak regularly, yes? Has he said anything about me? I just love these little lines that Herod has where Caiaphas is like so serious and he's like building this up so much to be this like really important thing. And then Herod Antipas will just come back at him and be like, yeah, you know, like just kind of totally wipe it off. Like it's not a big deal at all. You have to watch the scene to understand what I'm talking about, but it was so good. So then he talks again about the prophecy and what's going to be happening here. Herod then begins to poke at Caiaphas's family because Caiaphas was put into place as the high priest because of his father-in-law Annas. Okay. The line kind of goes like this: Annas, and then Annas has a son called Ananus, and then Caiaphas married into the family via Annas's daughter. Okay. So when Annas was in charge before, when he was the high priest, the previous governor to Pilate had to depose him, had to make sure that he went away, and then Caiaphas was put in his place. The reason for this is because Annas was like killing people, like it was his job. Okay, and so basically Herod is saying you were influenced by Annas to want to kill Jesus here. Maybe that's not the right play, right? Maybe we shouldn't do that here. Is basically what he's getting at. And he keeps on poking at Caiaphas' family and kind of what's going on here, but the way that he does it is just amazing throughout the scene. Now he says, why suggest to kill Lazarus if you think I shouldn't kill Jesus, is what Caiaphas says. And then Herod responds with, Lazarus is a nobody. Like nobody's going to care about him. If you kill Jesus, the streets are going to rile up and they're going to want to kill you because you killed Jesus, right? This is clearly not what you're meant to do, or not, or what you shouldn't do, right? Jesus is different. There are too many people here, says Herod. I don't want to do any of this, essentially, is what Caiaphas gets to the point of. He's like, I don't want to kill Lazarus or Jesus. I don't want to do any of this, but I have to figure out what to do here because our city, our nation is being ripped apart. We need to figure out what's going on here. Jesus has too much power. Clearly, Jesus is this guy that the prophecy is telling me about. Clearly, Jesus is this guy that God is saying will die so that we can survive, right? They continue to talk here, and they say, we must wait for Jesus to misspeak to garner the ire of Rome, because we can't kill him. If we kill him, everybody's going to be mad at us. But if Rome kills him, they're already mad at Rome. So why would they be mad at us, right? They couldn't be mad at us. They'd have to be mad at Rome, right? And so then Herod is like, well, how are you going to get him to misstep? How are you going to get him to misspeak? He's not prone to doing that. And so Caiaphas says, I will prompt him. I'll make sure that we can make him misspeak in some way. Then the episode, the scene ends with, there's one thing that people hate more than they love Jesus. And then it just goes quiet. So they don't finish that sentence there. They're going to obviously continue this in the Sanhedrin and some other places. But this is leading us up to the place where everybody turns against Jesus, right? We're going to see that and how that happens in real time, which will be very, very cool to see. So that is my favorite scene. That scene, I cannot wait to break it down in more depth later on. There's so many little like hidden things and amazing moments within that. I cannot wait to watch it with you guys and go through it deep dive whenever it comes out later. So Cophny then approaches Thomas in the marketplace. Thomas is shopping for food for the Passover, specifically cucumbers. And so he's looking at each one, analyzing it and looking at it. And Kaphne basically says like, "Oh, you're as observant as ever. You know, you're kind of picking out the best one throughout here." And Thomas looks over. He's really surprised, and he's like, "What's going on, Kaphne? Like you're here, blah blah blah." And Kaphne says, "Buy your ingredients now, for it's your last supper. It's for your last supper with the rabbi, basically." And so he's calling out Jesus, and he gets really angry. He quickly grabs Thomas and kind of shakes him, and they get really rough pretty immediately, to the point where the people around them are like wondering if they should call in a Roman guard or a temple guard or someone to help. And so they're like looking around, and then finally one of the men that comes with Kaphne earlier takes him away from Thomas, as he's kind of yelling at him. But the whole time he's yelling at him how it's going to be his last supper, how it's going to be Jesus' last supper, and he's going to get Jesus, essentially. Then he's pulled away. Thomas goes, and he's like obviously shaken up. And so he goes off to the side. He sits down on some steps, and then he looks up and he sees Rama again in the middle of the crowd. As the color sort of changes on the screen, he sees Rama as he looks up and he says, "Rama?" And then Rama's face turns into Naomi's face, who is Rama's mother. And so he says, "I thought you were," and then she kind of says, "Yeah, it happens to me as well," kind of reminiscing in that moment. They get another moment here to kind of reconnect. Of course, he loves Naomi, and Naomi kind of loves him as well, but she's kind of mad at him, right? She's not as mad as Kaphne, clearly, but she's kind of the softer side of the marriage, where she's like, "I want to hate you, but I can't." And so they kind of have a conversation here, as he actually admits some things within this conversation that kind of make him a little bit lighter within his emo-ness. He says, basically, he brings up Jesus, and then Naomi's like, I won't even let that name come out of my mouth. I hate that guy. Because of what happened with Rama. And then Thomas says, "I have been critical and resentful," and he says some other things, since these things are, he says, "I've been critical and resentful since," and then he kind of alludes to Rama's death. "These things are born in my own heart." And so he doesn't blame Jesus for those things. He's recognizing that he's being immature, that he is the one that is bringing up these things that hurt him. Doesn't make them any less real, but he is the reason why they exist, essentially, is where they are. And then he says, "I don't always understand unless things are spelled out for me." And so you can see this like sort of like turning a little bit from his emo-ness and recognizing that some of these problems are him, right? And not that Jesus did something wrong to him or hurt him, but that Thomas in his heart is having trouble with himself, if that makes sense. So then near the end of the scene, we see as they have a little bit of a conversation, then the apostles are actually running through the marketplace as they're calling out, "Rabbi, Rabbi." And Thomas then goes and follows them over to the temple. And he says goodbye to Naomi. He thanks her, and then he leaves. He goes towards the temple. Then we see Jesus in the temple. This is where we see the cleansing of the temple. Of course, this is a really big section of scripture here. So let me kind of talk through this, and then we'll read through it. So Jesus comes in the temple. He sees the same money changer that we saw earlier in the episode. He begins talking with him a little bit, and then the money changer says at the end of the conversation, he says, "So what are you going to pay with? What kind of currency are you going to pay with?" And then Jesus says, "You will see." And then he turns around and he opens his backpack and he pulls out the whip that he had, I guess, got from Phoebe's house, but then fashioned himself back in episode 1. He put like the cracker on the end of it. Then he goes to the table and he flips the table. He starts wreaking havoc all over the place. Okay. Right before he goes crazy and starts wreaking havoc, we see him actually talk to a vendor who is coming through the temple area in order to get to the market. She's taking like a shortcut essentially through the temple in order to get to the market on the other side. And she's right behind Jesus and she says, "Get out of my way." And Jesus is like, "No." And then she's like, "Please get out of my way. Like, come on, I gotta get to the market. It's a shortcut through here." And he's like, "Take your cart and go back the other way. Like, this is my Father's house. This is a house of prayer. This is a place of holiness. And you're taking your cart through here as a shortcut? Like, that's ridiculous, you know?" So he tells her to go back and she begins to go back. And right after this is when he has the conversation with the vendor, with the money changer. And then he goes crazy. He starts flipping the tables. we see a lot of chaos happening here, okay? He's like knocking over tents, he's knocking over tables, he's letting all these animals loose. We see some of the tents actually catch on fire from some sort of torch somewhere. I'm not exactly sure how that happened. One of the funniest moments in this, literally my entire theater both times burst out laughing, was Jesus's Indiana Jones moment whenever, like, I guess this is like a real thing. During the commentary, Dallas talks about this where they did it for real in one shot, basically in camera. They tried it for the first time and it was perfect right out of camera the very first time. And it's where Jonathan uses his whip and he like wraps it around the leg of a table and then pulls it back and like breaks the table leg. This is a very interesting shot, but both times my theaters like burst out laughing, like hilariously. So I'm not sure it was the exact emotion they were trying to convey, but that's what was conveyed there for sure. I know a lot of people were like, huh? That was a strange shot. It was cool though. It was cool overall. Like I get why they were trying to do it. Yeah, he just continues to rampage. He's like yelling out certain things. For example, he says, look what you've done in my father's house. And then he says, you've made my father's house a den of thieves, all this kind of stuff that we see in scripture. So let's read through some of this and then we'll get back to the end of this. And they came to Jerusalem and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. Now, this is particularly important because he does go to who we believe is Simon of Cyrene, and he knocks over his table as well, specifically. So this is the one who sold pigeons right there. So there's another connection there. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Again, another connection for the woman who was trying to carry her supplies to the other side to get through to the market. And he was teaching them and saying to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. And the chief priests and scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. So that's where we see that there in Mark chapter 11. So all of that basically happens. And then the episode essentially ends as the apostles, Andrew actually runs back to Phoebe's home. And he's like, Peter, come quick. And they all kind of like poke their head out the door. And then Peter's like, what's going on? What's happening? And then Andrew said, I don't know. He's gone mad. And then they run off and they head towards the temple. So the ending of this episode, after Jesus flips all the tables and does everything, obviously all of the priests and the leaders of the law are all gathering to see what's happening. And like, the temple guard are ready to take action if they need to. All the people are kind of gathering around Jesus and like wondering what's going on. And then finally, Jesus flips one final table. He walks down the stairs and he has the whip in his hand as he walks towards the religious leaders. And the episode ends as he's staring at them. And then the last line that we get in the episode is Jesus says, you brood of vipers. And then later we get Judas as he comes in and he finally sees what Jesus is doing. And he's like, what have you done? And this is kind of the breaking moment for Judas. This is kind of the breaking moment of like, I don't think I can trust this dude anymore, and so we're going to see the aftermath of that clearly going into episode 3 and then seeing where that goes from there. But yeah, pretty intense stuff overall from this episode. I will say in the cleansing of the temple, you guys know me, like I'm nitpicky, right? I try to think of everything in terms of like, what if I didn't love this show? What if I was watching this for the first time? What if I was just watching this like any other show, right? There was some acting in this episode that felt really stiff. It felt very robotic. The two that I can think of is Reza as he's playing Philip. There are certain portions, especially in the exposition portion, that I feel like were just not very good. There's some other portions where I think he did a fine job, but some portions within that exposition early on I think were kind of rough. And then also I was really surprised to see Jonathan during the cleansing. There are some portions, some of the dialogue that just felt super robotic, and I'm not sure if it's the way that they shot it or because like he was trying to be like more angry or whatever. I just did not buy it like I do with many of his other scenes. There's not really another time where I can think like, oh, he kind of fell flat for me. So that was really it was really interesting to see that. So because of that, because of the exposition scene, I rate this one a little bit lower probably closer to like a 6.5. This episode was good, but I felt like as a whole, that these 2 episodes, obviously there's a lot of setup being done. Like I said, it has my favorite scene in it. But I think overall I think I would rate this episode like a 6.5, maybe a little bit higher than that. But yeah, that's where I'm at. I think there was just some parts that kind of missed the mark a little bit on this one for me. So anyway, let me know your thoughts about this one overall. The episode ends right there as Jesus is looking towards the religious leaders, and then we're going to pick up right there in episode 3 would be my guess. So lots of stuff to come. Of course, we're going to see episode 3 later this week. And we'll get into it whenever that comes out. So let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.